At this time, I'm going to be asking Dean Acosta, who is the Dean for the College of Law, to come to the podium and introduce our keynote this afternoon. Dean Acosta, I won't keep you waiting. Could you come to the podium, please?
Well, first, let me say thank you, and thank you for organizing this event. I see a lot of folks from the College of Law, so thank you for coming, and thank you to the rest of the individuals from the university community who are here, some deans, some faculty, many students. I want to thank you for being part of this. I wanted to introduce Professor Heriberto Rahman. Professor Rahman has been with the College of Law since its founding. We recently celebrated our 10th anniversary, and he's one of the original founding faculty members. During those 10 years, he's done a number of outstanding, been involved in a number of outstanding activities. On the teaching front, he's taught not only the College of Law, but if memory serves, he taught in the Honors College at one point. He was Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. He's received teaching excellence awards, been voted by the students throughout his career. More recently, he did something that I think is truly unique, where he, along with another one of our faculty members, started a weekend clinic to help individuals that are seeking to regularize their immigration status. Actually, I think regularize is in the incorrect word, but are seeking to address their immigration status, let me just say, and I can be corrected. On the scholarship front, Professor Rahman is also incredibly impressive. He's editor of an NYU book series. He's published Citizen and Immigration in the Americas book series with NYU Press, The Alien Invasion, which is a forthcoming book with NYU Press, Understanding Immigration with Carolina Academic Press, Citizenship and Its Exclusions, Classical, Constitutional, and Critical Race Theories Perspective with NYU Press, The Other American Colonies, A Constitutional and International Law Examination of the United States' 19th and 20th Century Island Conquest with Carolina Academic Press. And these are just the books he's published. I'm not going to go into the articles, but incredibly prolific, very scholarly, but most importantly, really, really involved in the immigration issues. And this is why these matter. We're talking about the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King. We're talking about civil rights and what civil rights mean today. Well, depending on the estimates, there are between 11 and 15 million individuals in the United States that are in a non-regular immigration status or undocumented status or illegal status, depending on your word of choice. Of those, there are approximately 200,000 that were brought to the United States as minors, as children. And the question becomes, what happens to them when they turn of age? This struck us particularly here in Miami a few years ago. Do any of you remember the individuals from Killeen High School? Did anyone here go to Killeen High? Killeen. So do you remember the individuals from Killeen High going back about 4 years? They were brought to the United States, I believe, from Colombia when they were maybe 2-3 years old. The parents were deported back to Colombia, and then the question is, what happens to them? Because they're not here legally. Should they go back, even though most folks don't remember the country they lived in when they were 2 years old? And many of those individuals have been called dreamers, and Professor Rahman has worked with them, with their community, and with the students at our law school to address their legal status. And so with that, Professor Rahman.
More than anything else, what Dean Acosta made me realize is that I'm old. Okay. Getting more to the point, I want to thank Dean Acosta not only for being a great dean, but he actually gave up on a phone call with certain Capitol Hill leaders on immigration reform that's going on right now to be here with us. So I appreciate his efforts as always. In terms of this talk, I want to talk about issues that many of us are aware of and draw parallels on issues that we're often not aware of. And one of the things I just told my students last week with respect to advocacy, raising arguments, taking a position, one of the strongest points you can make is to create empathy. In terms of my scholarship, as I started in academia, and in terms of my personal identity, issues with respect to the second class or marginalized citizenship of the people of Puerto Rico was always something that troubled me. And in one conference I gave several years ago, I recall after the conference speaking to a colleague. This colleague happened to be a progressive scholar, happened to be African American. And after I went into my detailed talk, and I was quite impressed with my presentation, he said to me something that troubled me, but it was also poignant. He said, of all the human rights abuses in the world, all the marginalization efforts in the world, why should I care and why should others care about the plight of 4 million people? And when we're talking about the plight of the inability to vote, we're not talking about human trafficking, we're not talking about killing individuals. And I was in the throes of my scholarly momentum. I was like, how dare you, right? But on reflection, I said, well, there's something to that. And one of the goals I made thereafter was to recognize an important point when taking a stand on issues is to have people empathize. If I tell you about a story that you're unaware of, that you're unfamiliar with, that you can't relate in terms of something that you can identify with in terms of your story, your narrative, there's a distance that's really hard to bridge. And that's in some respects answers a question I was asked. I don't know if she was in the room because we didn't meet personally, over the phone by one of the student reporters for the Beacon, in terms of, oh, interesting, in light of your resume, talking about MLK it struck me as interesting after going into it for quite a bit. She said, oh, I look forward to hearing the talk. Now let's see if she was telling me the truth. Is she in here? Well, maybe she had a conflict, okay, like my other colleagues. Nevertheless, what I want to look to are social movements, right? And the important and iconic force that who I think is a person that was a blessing to our country, but also to the world, in terms of the figure that is known as Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to talk about his legacy then and now. Most of us would probably not question his transcendent power. In movements that occurred not only within this country that affected African Americans, but also affected many other groups, Latinos, other groups, white women who arguably have been the greatest beneficiaries of the civil rights movement of the 60s. During the revolution in Eastern Europe, they were looking to songs and verbiage and speeches of Dr. King in terms of his power, lasting power, not unlike of Mahatma Gandhi, who he was a student of, not literally, but in terms of studying his teachings. But we should appreciate, in terms of social movements, our iconic figures of today weren't necessarily so during their time. Okay? Dr. King was actually a radical. He was actually characterized as a subversive. Certainly more palatable than some other civil rights leader like Malcolm X, but I believe they're part of the same coin in terms of the juxtaposition and the alternatives that society may have been faced with. But in terms of how he was characterized, we should not lose sight of the fact that he was a target of the FBI that spent millions of dollars to try to discredit him and his efforts, that did things, among others, classifying him as a communist, to secretly recording his personal activities, right, and trying to demean him and undermine him, as if any of us can easily pick up a stone, particularly when we had a leader, right, of the FBI that perhaps had an affinity, as far as what I'm told, and the media suggests, for women's lingerie. In terms of J. Edgar Hoover, and the last I recall, he's got a massive building in Washington in his honor. But we rarely, if ever, hear about such things. Certainly didn't occur during his lifetime. At one point, the level of attack and persecution went as far as the FBI sending a letter to Dr. King, threatening to expose him and suggesting that instead of destroying his wife and children, he should go on and kill himself. He should literally go on and kill himself. Indeed, the attacks occurred on different fronts. He was not only attacked by the establishment, he was attacked by his fellow clergymen. in terms of being considered an outside agitator, to be considered a troublemaker, to go to areas where he didn't belong. And he was attacked even by those that were arguably his fellow travelers, younger people involved in the civil rights struggle, viewing him as too passive, as waiting too long, as not willing to engage fast enough and strong enough and defiant. Well, in the midst of one of these attacks, he, I believe, became the iconic individual in our lifetime. Perhaps others can fall within that category, but I think there's none other to match him, particularly when his fellow clergymen attacked him and told him to stop, to be quiet. In jail, he wrote something that's particularly poignant to civil rights and social justice movements of our time. While in jail, he said something that should guide us today and responds to some critics who say Martin Luther King didn't look beyond, arguably, race, perhaps jobs, perhaps war. Well, he went far beyond that. And it's a clarion call, I believe, for us at the epicenter of an important civil rights movement. This is what he wrote to his fellow clergymen. I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with a narrow, provincial, quote-unquote, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be concerned or considered, an outsider anywhere within his bounds. This was his reminder to his fellow travelers, his fellow, arguably, people of the cloth, telling them their proper perspective of hopefully what would follow in the future and still applicable today. Let's look for a moment at some of the iconic imagery of what occurred in these marches, where often he was in the center and other leaders that grew to be national figures like Jesse Jackson and others were there. But there were also quite a bit of young people that just stood up from all backgrounds, particularly in terms of the South, young African Americans, some white Northerners, a smattering of progressive religious leaders. They took to the streets that said, essentially, we're not going to accept the dominant norm, because in many respects what they were doing was illegal, was not sanctioned by the society, and they had to step up and speak out against unjust laws. And here, we often see him in the picture we saw at first, but here, more often than not, were pictures how he was characterized and viewed by the media as someone who merited being arrested. But what he reminded us, he reminded us of our collective obligation. And he pointed out, change does not roll in on wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. Today we witness some of those similar debates, and I'll raise some that some in this audience will differ with, some that I would probably have differed with just a year ago, but some of the civil rights leaders of today helped me seek enlightenment with respect to these issues. But we see those. We see those in ongoing struggles that in some respects people do not see as meritorious as struggles. We see it in the civil rights struggles, including the restoration of rights from arcane, punitive, and illogical barricades to access to those who have once committed a wrong. For those who are former felons in societies, especially this state, that have often arbitrary rules that make it incredibly difficult for the poor, disproportionately affected thereby Latinos and African Americans in terms of restoring their rights. It certainly decided at least one presidential election. This is a struggle that I'm very proud to say one of the your fellow students in terms of FIU, an FIU law student took it upon it almost single-handedly, and Mr. Meade, and started to create a national movement that's bringing forth enlightenment and engagement with respect to these issues and putting pressure. I believe, if I read a post correctly today, when former Governor Jeb Bush was here, he says, I'm about to challenge him on rights, or to make the commitment. And that's the engagement that we have in a community, and in terms of my age group, right? And I suffer from that classic problem that men, we think of each other, we think of ourselves that as if we were in our 20s, until we see pictures and we realize the opposite. Perhaps women, I know women take a different approach with respect to that. But other struggles that go on. Other struggles that go on in terms of the civil rights struggle are struggles associated with the fact that we live in a society that our Constitution says we should separate church and state. And yet, with respect to the bundle of rights associated with marriage, we use the church to limit said rights. Now that's at least illogical for me. All right? To basically have laws dictated by the church when our basic precept is to keep the two apart, and it is the way to ensure that we don't have equality in marriage in terms of these issues. But because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on a movement that's here, where we have leaders, and I'm really honored. I'm so honored to have some of them here that started this effort, that they're so young. I think at times they don't always appreciate. And to the extent that one of my next book projects will be to sit them down and document this, if I ever get them to slow down, will be to talk about immigration and the Dreamer movement. And we see, in terms of the slides, right, the iconic imagery of people getting up. Oftentimes young, not always, but people eventually, right, having that amazing moment on the great lawn in terms of the iconic vision about his future and our future. But today, we've seen similar frustrations. We saw, and I was just talking to one of the leaders a moment ago, how in Miami, a group of 4 undocumented young people, right, were involved in a variety of civil rights efforts that really didn't seem to be going far enough, quick enough for them. And at one point, one in particular had a conversation with an older gentleman that happened to be involved in the 1960s civil rights movement, and talked about the Underground Railroad, and talked about the marches that occurred in the 1960s. And as a couple can testify here, one just got home to Miami and said, we're walking, basically just a few years ago. And not unlike the efforts of freedom walkers of the 1960s, we had young people just risk, right? And albeit in the 1960s, the young people faced death, right? Some did, right? They faced the possibility and the reality. In some respects, that physical violence, without question, perhaps was not as apparent, but certainly they faced the KKK and other groups. Yet they faced a fear and a danger, I think, that is almost at least as palpable in my mind. Imagine you live in your world, in your home, be it in Boca, be it in Pembroke Pines, in Hialeah, or in Westchester, and everything you know and everyone you know will change at a moment's notice to essentially be taken to another world that you're unfamiliar with. Well, each one of them faced it. They were undocumented, and they decided to raise attention to the efforts of the DREAM Act that would allow, for over 10 years, Congress has fought to allow undocumented children and young people who came here, right, in more than any other way to be viewed as innocents, came here with their parents, that some conservatives still characterize as illegal, but frankly came with their parents who responded to an economic demand created by this country. And it's a conversation we rarely have, but these young people did essentially nothing wrong other than travel with their parents. And this DREAM Act has been often tortured and mischaracterized, and we see it today to try to stop this effort. But they didn't have an MLK, they didn't have a Medgar Evers, they didn't have a Malcolm X and others. They had courage, what I call in Spanish, coraje. And if any of you know me, and I know quite a few of you do, in a law class, I can be the toughest cookie in the book in terms of my expectation and my demands. But I recall just being on television just 2 nights ago when one of my dreamer friends, Scarlett, was telling her story. And I'm telling myself, Heriberto, do everything you can not to cry on camera in terms of this story. That's just going to destroy whatever aura of the evil law professor you may have. But more importantly, they put a face. They put an accurate face. Okay? Perhaps a romanticized face in the eyes of some, and that's okay. Because versus the face of blood in, blood out, American me, mi vida loca, and time again, the stereotypical, demeaning depiction of the hot Latin, of the gallero, of the musician. These young people, with incredible courage and power, provide a different narrative. And truth be told, in that show, the host said, "This is one of my proudest moments as a professional." And I agreed with him. You know, we almost had a love fest of crying right there. Fortunately, we avoided it. These young people with incredible power and incredible determination largely started in South Florida. Right? We hear the Gang of 8 right now proposing comprehensive immigration. I don't know if these 4 should be called the Fantastic Four or what, but it's a little late for that. But we saw more and more young people getting out and challenging and demanding the DREAM Act. They came from undocumented people, documented people, and from time to time old fogies to be involved, and really started to change the picture of what we see in terms of what's right. So much so that just last year, right, Time magazine identifies an iconic figure with respect to an undocumented Pulitzer Prize winner, came out and spoke to these issues to put a face, but there's thousands. And as Dean Acosta correctly pointed out, in Florida alone, the estimate's up to 200,000 undocumented individuals. And in terms of these issues, it basically took nearly 6 months, nearly half a year, to walk, literally, from Miami to DC to raise attention. And from that, there have been subsequent walks. And it's documented. You see, I'm moving Carlos so much. One of the walkers, I'm moving him to tears. That was my goal in this effort. Don't deny it. Help me out. But for me, honestly, I was in awe. Because Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are my heroes in terms of the narratives I grew up with. I didn't see that in action in terms of generationally. But a few years ago, there was a student organization, and Karen, where are you? The Public Health Students for Advocacy and 20 other things, and Immigrant Rights. It's the worst acronym, but a fantastic group. Had a conference on a Friday night at about 8 o'clock at night where over 100 FIU undergrad students attended to talk about the DREAM Act, and Carlos was there. And I had been writing about these related issues in terms of immigration reform and the narrative of Latinos and Latinas, but I knew in terms of power of his presentation and that of others, and the excitement in the room, that more had to be done. And would remove all doubt. In one instance, I happened to have the good fortune of going with a few from an advocacy group that did a bus ride to Tallahassee. Because if we recall, just a couple of years ago, Florida was considering passing a law similar to Arizona's SB 1070. And this advocacy group by the name of FLIC, with several other student groups, had some buses go up and fight against this. And I felt honored. I think I may have been the only gray-haired person, other than certain farm workers, that were there. But largely young people. Right? Overnight ride. Fastest night of my life. I learned so much from so many people. But what was really powerful for me is that I don't think Sabash is in here. An activist at the time and radio talk show host pointed out the moment we arrived, and there was a church group that provided some breakfast for the group. Sabash says the Minutemen all right, and Tea Partiers are out there waiting, all right? And this was a bus with a good percentage, and I never ask. I have a bad memory. But as an attorney, in terms of any work I do, unless it's relevant to assisting you or representing you, I'm not going to ask you, right? Who do you love? What is your immigration status? It's irrelevant. But I knew there were undocumented people in that bus. I knew there had to be. And you know what these young kids did? You know, it moves me. It moves me so much because the sap I am, I just sat in the back and cried and prayed. Honestly, I just prayed for them. They went out and put on their caps and gowns and they walked out, not knowing what was going to happen. Not knowing what was going to happen. Truth be told, right? The police came and the folks dispersed. There was this beautiful little 2-year-old, same age as my daughter, there with her farm worker parents there. She didn't know what was going on. I just knew she was beautiful, and her parents were going to try to do everything they could, right, to make her dreams come true. They were forceful. They were powerful. The Senate, we had what was called Dream University. We had classes outside and talked about the law and the failures of the Senate in the state of Florida and in constitutional law perspective in other areas. Meanwhile, I was terrified. And I said, I do have tenure. All right? But nevertheless, I was there with these young people, and I seemed like to be the only person of age in the room, literally outside the Senate doors. And at one point, a group of girls, I don't remember if anyone here was there on that visit, I just don't recall. A group of them would take a bench, a large wooden bench, and carry it into the Senate floor room, because they weren't making room for them to speak. It was a public meeting. So by law, they had a right to be there, but there wasn't any room. That was the argument, because they wanted to pass SB 1070. They want different version of SB 1070, the anti-immigrant law, and they didn't want any discussion. So I'm advising this group of 5, all right? No, you shouldn't do this. You're going to go to jail for one thing, but I might too. You know, so I think I have this group at ease. But another leader, one of the original members of the Dream Walk, Felipe Sosa, was organizing 3 others to go into the top floor of the Senate building in their caps and gowns and sing the Pledge of Allegiance. And it stopped the conversation cold. It stopped. When I heard of it, I was running, right, or terrified for them. And I finally saw them in the Senate leader's office, and they were being warned by the sergeant at arms that we're going to be arrested. Again, I was terrified for them because of the consequences to them. I think I may have texted the dean, said, by the way, are you licensed in the state? I need it. Others may need an attorney. So I was gathering. Fortunately, one of the things that Carlos has reminded me, that outing himself and themselves has been powerful. And that's something they know as advocates far more than I do. So in terms of Dr. King's revolutionary and powerful moment, he tells us in terms of his Center for Nonviolence, and I say he because I think it's in the active voice, someone that has had such influence in our society, in our world, is still with us in so many ways. He points to the 6 steps of nonviolent social change: information gathering, education, including developing future leaders. Boy, there are a lot. There are a lot in this room. A personal commitment. We've seen these young people do that, risking essentially all. Negotiation, direct action. And boy, do we see direct action. We see it around the country nowadays. We see it at Georgia State University, where students sat down at the entrance of the university and were arrested, many of them undocumented, challenging these unfair laws in terms of their versions of SB 1070. And in many respects, Dr. Martin Luther King speaks to us today. And he speaks to dreamers today. And he speaks to everyone in this room today. In a eulogy for one of the key young civil rights leaders during one of the marches, he wrote, "One bright day our nation will recognize its real heroes. There will be thousands of dedicated men and women with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face fury and hostile mobs with the agonizing loneliness that characterized the life of the pioneers. They will be faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, black and white, who have temporarily left behind the towers of learning to storm the barricades of violence and hate. King was speaking to us. And in his honor, I want to point out, at the FIU-Center, some of these. Two original dream walkers, Gabby Pacheco and Carlos Roa. Where's Gabby? Please stand for a moment without applause. Stand for a moment, if you mind. Because this is part of an educational process, but hopefully will end with a revival. Other local dreamers that have been leaders in groups like SWEAR and other groups, like Scarlett Hernandez, please. Leaders from our own Dream Clinic and FIU SWEAR, and leaders that are also young but have been instrumental, like Jose Diaz, in terms of United We Dream, in terms of organizing, ensuring everything from food and chairs. I've seen them early nights. Please, don't be modest, come on. Hopefully future law student, right? In terms of other efforts, our own Dean Acosta, who unwavering in his support for our efforts with the Dream Clinics and every effort. My colleague, who the day President Obama made his announcement, I think we were on the phone or by email, in the midst of one thing or another, knew that this was a moment after years of trying to get different groups to mobilize. We were able to get a coalition of not only FIU, College of Law, we were able to get at least one professor from University of Miami, leaders from various organizations, including Americans for Immigrant Justice and FLIC and other organizations. Juan Gomez, too modest. All right? His colleague. All right? Jordan, all right? Former graduate, adjunct professor there at the clinics. Farah, all right? Also a graduate and immigration expert there every weekend. And more than any other organization in the country, we've helped up to 1,000 families. Over 700 dreamers have submitted their applications, right? And I know for a fact, we have lawyers, we have judges, we have physicians, engineers that are in the making. Law students, how many of you here, right? How many law students and other law professors were at the clinic? Please, for a second. Come on. I saw you, right? Have been here, given their time, not always knowing what we're doing, right? What we're doing and exhausted in these 12-hour days. So undergraduate students, right? Nicholas and others from FIU, Miami-Dade, that have taken from their time to taking a leadership stance. Administrative leaders at the university and at the law school that have spoken out on these issues, that have written upon these issues. Have we done enough? No, we haven't. We haven't done enough. But among this group, look at where 4 people started, right? And this room of about 50 to 100, how much we could do, how much engagement we can make. To draw parallels, to draw empathy between a rights movement, rights restoration movement, equality of marriage, full membership in our society, comprehensive reform. Because if we rest now, we're going to get yes to death and nothing's going to occur. So this is a movement. There's a lot of scholarship out there in critical race theory that talks about consequential moments. Hopefully this is one. And FIU puts its place. All of you are interested in civil rights, forced to by one professor or another to be here, right? But nevertheless, we're in the classes. Hopefully we can continue. We can use our collective efforts and we can continue the engagement. And if nothing else, show the power of diversity. The power and the commitment of diversity and the force that it has, because the credibility with which people who live it can speak it. And draw parallels between our brothers and sisters. Thank you.